I manage the ORX News service, and today we have 45 minutes and we've got a packed agenda full of insights and updates on our most recent content and resources. Before we start, I'm just going to take you through a few housekeeping rules. So just still giving a few minutes for those who are joining. So it's a webinar, so please keep yourself on mute for the duration of the webinar to avoid background noises. And if you do have any questions, and we do encourage your queries throughout, please use the group chat. We will aim to answer the queries either in the chat or at the end of the session if we have time for a Q&A session. The webinar will be recorded and you will receive a recording via email alongside a feedback form. And yeah, if the quality of the video is not very good, just turn off your video and it might improve. And if you use a headset for best quality. Okay, I think the numbers have steadied, so I think we'll just get started. I'll take you through the agenda for the day. We'll be covering quite a few topics. Most of them have been suggested by our subscribers via the subscriber survey, as well as the topic survey for this specific webinar. So thank you to everyone who did submit a response. It was really useful to put this pack together and inform our decision making around themes. I'll start by taking you through the first half of 2023, looking at the losses so far, and taking you through the Data Explorer, which is a new piece of work that we've produced this year. I'll also give you a brief update on climate, events we've seen so far, and new tools and resources from ORX since the last webinar. Helen will also be giving you an update on cyber with some key takeaways from the Cyber Forum and the Cyber Service. And then the two in focus topics for today are information security and operational resilience, which were both really, really high on the theme list submitted. I'm joined today by Helen, our head of services, who oversees news, scenarios and cyber, as well as news team members Stanka and Izzy, who will take you through the in focus topics for today. Okay, so just looking at the first half of the year. In July, we published the Media Review, which you can find on the ORX News website, and it gives an overview of the losses incurred in the first half of 2023. Some noteworthy insights from the review are that we have seen slightly more events compared to the first half of 2022, and quite a significant decrease in severity, which can be explained by last year's largest event, accounting for over $7 billion paid by Allianz over the structured alpha fund's misconduct. 2023's largest loss so far was incurred by International Petroleum Investment Company and ARBA, who agreed to pay $1.8 billion to the government of Malaysia to settle a dispute over funds embezzled from Sovereign Wealth Fund 1MDB. The most impacted business line for this half of the year remains retail banking, just as last year, and it's followed by commercial banking and trading and sales, who both accounted for 14% of losses. So this first half of the year. Interestingly, these are also the top 3 impacted business lines in the loss data sharing service submitted by our members. In terms of risk type, conduct accounted for 50% of events covered by ORX News and 35% of severity. And what we've seen in the ORX loss data submitted by our members is that conduct accounts for around a third of the total number of active events in each half of the year and around 2/3 of the total severity. However, it's worth mentioning that the risk taxonomy conduct can be matched to 3 level 1 event types, which are internal fraud, client products and business practices, and execution, delivery and process management, which will naturally make up a majority of the submitted events. You can explore the Media Review further by using the Data Explorer, which you can find on the news site on the same page as the Media Review. And you can use it to benchmark against other risk types and check the top 5 largest losses by risk. And I'll briefly show you the Data Explorer on this page. What you can do here, you can select a risk on the top left. For example, we mentioned conduct, as you can see, there's most of the events here. internal fraud. And it will be highlighted in light green. You'll get the number of events here. You'll get the top 5 largest losses listed here with a link to the relevant digest. You can see the cumulative losses here, and you can see the loss distribution on the bottom right. You can click to the specific event and it will take you straight to the specific event type. So this is just another way to see the losses for the first half of 2023. I'll take you back to the slides. Now, some updates on climate. Climate was one of our topics last year, and we talked about it as an emerging risk, and at the time we only had 5 climate-related events in ORX News, and ORX had recently published the paper Climate Risk and Operational Risk, the ORX Approach, which defines climate more as a causal factor for operational risk events rather than a risk per se. Climate risk can be broken down into 2 types, physical and transition risk, for which we have 2 scenario categories, which you can use on the news site to find relevant events. But you can also find related climate events using the ORX News Industry Loss Event Climate Risk, which is a flag with which we've tagged all climate-related events. Now we have 22 climate-related events in ORX News, and 50% of those now fall under physical risk and are tagged with the risk taxonomy, physical security and safety. These include events such as branch damage caused by extreme weather, as well as damage caused by protesters and activists. While a quarter of climate events are related to transitional risk and tagged with the taxonomy level 1 conduct and level 2 improper distribution, marketing, or client mistreatment. These include ESG misrepresentations and misstatements in relevant marketing material. And last week, we saw the latest greenwashing settlement. This was paid by DWS, who settled for $19 million with the Securities and Exchange Commission over greenwashing claims. With an increase in demand for climate-related information, especially following our poll from last year's webinar, where a lot of users responded that they were interested in knowing about climate risk at financial and non-financial institutions, we started the Climate Roundup, which collates summaries of articles related to this theme, and you can find out more about what regulators are saying and what climate-related litigations are ongoing via the Climate Roundup. Can click here. Another resource by ORX is the Greenwashing Scenario Toolkit, which includes the Greenwashing Scenario Development Handbook from ORX Scenarios. This is a 38-page handbook with practical step-by-step guidance to creating a greenwashing scenario, as well as selecting a selection of greenwashing resources from ORX News, including a deep dive about BNY Mellon's fine over ESG misrepresentations, 2 in-focus blog pieces regarding greenwashing and ESG, and 5 ORX news stories. Subscribers have made use of the toolkit to either develop new scenarios or review existing scenarios, looking at the 3 themes around which greenwashing has been analysed, which are misleading advertising, mis-selling, and misreporting. If you're interested in knowing more about the toolkit or other climate-related resources, visit our member site or just get in touch directly. Now I would like to introduce you to Helen, who joined us late in 2022 as Head of Services, and she will be giving us an update on the next topic, which is cyber, the Cyber Forum. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lily, and hi, everybody. So yeah, as Lily said, we thought it'd be useful to give you and give you an update and share some information from the Cyber Service Forum, which is something that we hold on an annual basis, both in North America and in Europe. And it won't come as a surprise to many of you that cyber continues to remain one of the key concerns for firms, and that we see obviously in through our ORX top risk report, and also we're hearing it from our cyber subscribers as well. In those forums that we held in both London and New York, they were attended by circa 45 firms, all subscribers and members of ORX, and the ORX Cyber Service, and around 60 people attended from cyber and security risk professional backgrounds. And in that session, we covered key topics such as the key concerns and priorities in the industry, AI, and we also held a number of breakout sessions covering a number of topics that we did a deep dive on. So I'm just going to cover a couple of items that were key takeaways from those sessions. Again, probably not as a surprise to many of you that third party was a key topic that keeps coming up, and it keeps coming up, not just in cyber, but also I think in the broader op risk context. So it's a clear concern across the industry. And one of the takeaways was the feeling that third parties are often the weak link in the control environment. So events like the Move It vulnerability can have a huge knock-on effect, like we've seen in the industry. And we'll talk to that particular event a little bit later on. We'll also be considering how we factor in the topic of third parties into our cyber service, because as I say, it is something that keeps coming up again and again. And we shared ideas in which that could be improved, perhaps sharing more information regarding third parties within the cyber service. So it's something that we are taking forward into our planning for next year as well. Another key topic, again, not a surprise, is AI. Um, and we were joined by guest presenters McKinsey, um, who provided a really insightful presentation on the key challenges surrounding the adoption of AI and what is the optimum response. So within that, there was some discussion of what the key risks associated with AI are. And aside from data privacy, it included unintended consequences. So is there a disparity between desired behaviour and actual outcomes, especially since establishing testing requirements for those types of models is difficult. And also explainability. There was a comment that lots of people are asking questions about the explainability of the outputs of these models. But worryingly, not having the answers doesn't seem to be slowing anyone down. So the key takeaway from McKinsey and the advice that was given was get involved as early as possible if you're working within cyber and security in your firms, because it will help develop and can help develop understanding and can help mitigate the risk. And one of the key takeaways, again, for personally, was make sure you are close to your chief strategy officer, your chief innovation officer, so that you get onto the front foot and understand exactly what are the plans for AI in your firm, so you can develop understanding and plans from a risk perspective. Another key takeaway from the session was that appropriate governance of use cases is essential, including roles and responsibilities. So understanding the specific risks associated with each use case will help with developing appropriate controls. There was quite a bit of a debate in the European forum around to block or not to block when talking about ChatGPT. The majority of that group were blocking, and of those who were not, some were experimenting with low risk, low customer impact in processes, but making sure that there was rigorous monitoring involved to then inform control environments. So quite an interesting stance there. And in comparison to the European Cyber Forum held early in the year, there seemed to be less discussion of the potential benefits in the North America Forum, in terms of the adoption of AI technologies, with the focus there being firmly on the associated risks. The other key topic was data. So first and foremost, that access to high quality data is still a key challenge. Roles and responsibilities are still unclear in some cases. So for example, who owns the data and metrics? Should it be first or should it be second line? And a conversation was held around creating metrics is often easy, but establishing the right metrics where they should be reported and if and how they should be aggregated is still an ongoing open question. Some attendees commented that the ultimate goal for having such metrics, or that holy grail, is around the effectiveness of quantification of cyber risk. And that is still an ongoing challenge. So, how do you actually put a monetary value on the cyber risk exposure? Which nicely brings me on to my last point around quantification, which I think it is fair to say that there, there wasn't a consensus in either forum. So that across the industry, that there's that lack of consensus on cyber risk quantification. Some subscribers talked about using the FAIR methodology, and others have moved away from this. So, still quite a lot of change ongoing in this space. But there was a clear view that an approach was needed before something externally was imposed, for example, by regulators. Additionally, there was also a conversation around creating meaningful risk appetite. Um, and clearly, there's a connection there in ensuring a consistent quantification approach is agreed across the industry. So hopefully that gives you a useful insight into those forums. And I'll pass over to Stanka, who's going to provide some insight in what we're seeing also in the news data.
Hello, everyone. During our first webinar last year, I spoke about the news team's coverage of cyber event using the ORX reference taxonomy level 1 risk information security, including cyber. So I just wanted to give you a little update on that. I think most people attending will be familiar with our coverage standards and thresholds, but just in case there are newer users of the service, ORX News also covers significant cybercrime losses and data breaches at non-financial firms. These are tagged under the banking standards using the business line corporate items. So just something to bear in mind when looking at the data. This graph that we're seeing here illustrates the frequency of cyber events in the news database over the past 5 years. And it includes a breakdown per level 2 taxonomies. So cyber events, which includes things like cyber attacks, data privacy breaches, and data thefts. We do also have 2 additional level 2s, data loss and improper access to data, which don't really tend to come up as much. As you can see, the numbers have remained pretty constant. We cover between 80 to 100 infosecurity events per year. This is despite the fact that cyber risk is constantly among the top concerns within the top risk review. There is a slight spike in level 2 cyber events in 2021, which is due to adjustments in our coverage of events at crypto firms. Due to subscriber interest, we began covering the crypto sector quite heavily at the time, but we've since increased our thresholds. So since 2022, we've only covered crypto losses if they were over $50 million or if there was some sort of regulatory involvement. So we naturally capture fewer events. In terms of severity, it varies quite broadly from $367.5 million in 2019 to just over $2 billion in 2021 and 22. I think you'll be able to empathize. Collecting data and information related to the costs of data breaches is really difficult, especially from public sources. Helen touched on this briefly. Quantifying the impact of these events is tricky, and currently the focus tends to be on managing the reputational fallout. So these numbers are very likely not reflective of the real costs of data breaches and cyber attacks to the industry. Now for 2023, we've got a breakdown for each quarter. We've covered 59 events so far until the end of September, so it looks like this year will be in line with previous years. As I've mentioned, we're seeing a lot more events under the banking standards because that's how we categorize crypto firms and non-financial companies. Crypto hacks also make up a majority of the severity for the year, as they do typically have a clear loss amount attached to them. They're some of the largest events that we've reported on this year. Another significant event that I wanted to highlight is the hack at Latitude Financial, an Australian consumer finance firm. Latitude was hacked this year. It had to briefly take its services down on the 16th of March, 2023. Attackers were able to breach Latitude's internal systems, steal employee credentials, and then use those to access the company's service, 2 of the company's service providers. In total, about 14 million customers' data was breached, some going as far back as 2005. Authorities are still investigating the incident. It's currently unclear when exactly or for how long Latitude systems were breached. We do, however, know that this incident will cost Latitude upwards of 76 million Australian dollars, as per the firm's half-year results. This provision is made up largely of remediation costs. So, for one thing, Latitude is paying for customers to replace their stolen identity documents. But the sum does not include any future system enhancements, class actions, or potential regulatory fines. Now, you may also remember two other massive data breaches that occurred in Australia last year at Optus and insurer Medibank. Following those, the government passed legislation in November that increased the penalties for repeated or serious data breaches from $2.2 million to either $50 million, 30% of the company's adjusted turnover, or 3 times the value of any benefit obtained through the misuse of information. So Latitude is likely to become the first financial company to be penalized under the new sanctions regime. We'll be updating the digest as soon as more information becomes available. Now, AI has, of course, been a much requested topic for this webinar, so I did want to touch on it really quickly. In terms of our coverage in our news service, we've not really reported on any new AI-related incidents. We do have a couple of older stories in the system which cover deepfake or AI-generated voice clones, one affecting a bank and one affecting a non-financial company. They're from 2021 and 2019, respectively. One thing that we're hearing from members is that they're reluctant to use or have even banned these new technologies that have been reported on in the media, such as ChatGPT. The key issue is that these models, they're developed externally, they're not well understood. Some of them may be open source or contain open source elements, so they carry huge regulatory risks. Members instead prefer to develop solutions in-house that are geared towards simplifying internal processes rather than towards customers. Now, if you're interested in hearing more about this, we've written some blog posts that delve a bit deeper and collate our members' views. If you're unable to attend, we also publish summaries of our working group discussions, including the data science and data analytics communities, which do touch on these topics quite often. In terms of the regulatory landscape, it's broadly underdeveloped. The EU is one of the first regions that has a concrete proposal that's being debated. It's the AI Act, which is, or it will be reviewed by Parliament, the Commission, and the Council with a view to push it through by the end of the year. The AI Act will require organizations to classify AI solutions in risk-based categories based upon their use cases. And the US, again, members report tends to look to the EU, but things are still very much in the debate and proposal stage. The White House has brokered a number of voluntary safety commitments from leading AI companies in July. They've published a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, and Congress is actively engaging with stakeholders and industry representatives. The National Institute of Standards and Technology has been floated as a potential agency for AI. They did release an AI risk management framework, but the Institute does not hold any regulatory enforcement powers. Two other proposals for regulators are a CERN or an IEAE for AI. It's a mouthful. These suggestions are reportedly supported by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. The British government has created an Office for Artificial Intelligence, which is overseeing investment and research in this sector. In terms of risk, the National Cybersecurity Center has released a series of blog posts and speeches highlighting threats posed by AI, as well as guidance on assessing AI tools. China is one country that is slightly ahead of the curve. It first introduced legislation on algorithmic recommendations in early 2022, and 3 more laws have since come into force, focusing in particular on generative AI and deep synthesis technologies providing services to the public. Canada has also proposed the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act as part of the Digital Charter Implementation Act in 2022. And lastly, in Australia, there is currently no enforceable AI-specific regulations, but there is a voluntary AI ethics framework, and various existing Australian laws surrounding privacy and copyright can also be applied to AI. That's it for me, and I'll now hand over to my colleague Izzy for their presentation on resilience.
Thank you, Stanka. Hi, everyone. I'll be leading us through the final in focus topic for today's webinar. Operational resilience is interwoven through so many other risk themes and categories that it creates a greater potential for widespread disruption. It is increasingly recognized as a vastly important consideration for the financial services industry. The annual ORX Operational Risk Horizon Study canvasses industry opinion on the emerging risk landscape. As you can see here, in 2021, participants ranked operational resilience 10th in top emerging industry concerns. It jumps up to 4th place in 2022, showing a significant rise in consideration of resilience. In 2023, business service disruption was the second top concern in emerging risk categories, just behind advancing cybercrime. In fact, 60% of respondents placed it in their top 5 concerns. Many reasons are behind the uptick in focus on resilience: a rapidly changing technological landscape and rising cybercrime, increasing concern about third-party and concentration risk drivers, prioritizing systemic risk, escalating geopolitical factors, more frequent climate risk-related events. You can take your pick. ORX News categorizes each event against level 2 risks in ORX standards and taxonomies. If we take a look at the most commonly used level 2s to categorize resilience-related events over the past 5 years, we can see that cyber disruption is the most frequent type of risk event that we cover. The most commonly used scenario category is business application failures, with cyber-related business disruption coming in second. The level 2 taxonomy, software failure, is most often used, and then cyber events trails just behind. Finally, we classified more than half of resilience-related events under the event type technology and infrastructure failure. Ranking second is system security external, willful damage. Over the last 5 years, ORX News has reported on a total of 360 resilience-related events, with a total loss amount of $1.37 billion US. Broken down by region, we can see that Western Europe is by far the most impacted sector, with the highest frequency of events and the largest total loss amount at $898.8 million. For some other regions, there is a large discrepancy between frequency and loss severity rankings. Take, for example, North America, which has a lower frequency of events than in the Asia Pacific region, but more than twice the loss severity. Broadly speaking, this misalignment could be owed to the fact that most resilience-related stories reported on by ORX News were cyber-related disruptions. As both Stanka and Helen previously mentioned, the impacts and costs from these events are difficult for firms to quantify and therefore not often publicly disclosed. In fact, 88% of all resilience-related events that we've covered over the last 5 years had a not identifiable loss amount. We can also see here that the overwhelming majority of resilience-related events occurred in the banking sector, and the insurance sector accounted for just 5%. As Stanka just mentioned before, we do cover certain resilience events at non-financial firms under the banking standards if they meet our coverage thresholds or are particularly interesting with details of related costs. Although slightly more frequent than those from the insurance sector, non-financial firms still only account for 10% of covered resilience events. Next, we have a high-level overview of the regulatory approaches to resilience from the US, the UK, and the EU, looking at where they align and where they diverge. Ever since it was adopted by the European Parliament in November 2022, conversations about resilience inevitably lead to discussing DORA, or the Digital Operational Resilience Act. The centralized framework condenses focus areas for operational resilience into 5 core pillars. As you can see on the left here, these are risk management and governance, incident reporting, digital operational resilience testing, ICT third-party risk, and information sharing. Contrastingly, US regulators are more focused on consolidating existing guidance into effective resilience frameworks rather than amending or expanding on it. Central regulators published guidance in November 2020 emphasizing systemic risk and including expectations for firms to establish an impact tolerance for disruption pardon me, and identify key business services. The resilience framework in the UK that came into force in March 2022 includes the same focus areas of key business services and impact tolerances. It diverges slightly from the US though. Recent guidance from UK regulators in February of this year mainly considers systemic risk as posed by critical third parties and third-party risk. In the EU, DORA's third core pillar is dedicated to third-party risk and goes into further details such as risk strategy and concentration risk. The US later caught up with the focus on third-party risk in June 2023. Guidance issued by US regulators replaced prior general guidance on the topic, but it didn't impose any new requirements on firms. The same regulators previously mandated that banks notify authorities of cybersecurity incidents to identify emerging threats to the stability of the US financial system. You can note the theme of systemic risk throughout US regulation. DORA likewise encourages incident reporting to authorities and information sharing amongst the industry. Later, I will spotlight a recent story of this in action. Regulation in both the UK and the EU have moved away from questions of how likely is it that this risk event will materialise and instead encourage considering only impacts. Finally, DORA is the frontrunner in recommending regular testing of firms' cyber risk management framework, tools, and systems. We would be remiss to discuss operational resilience without spotlighting the MOVEit data breaches that have plagued the financial services industry in recent months. MOVEit, a file transfer software, had a zero-day vulnerability widely exploited by hackers and threat actors, including a prolific Russian cybercrime syndicate, in late May 2023. The vulnerability was quickly patched, but the damage had already been done. At our last count at the end of August, the sensitive data of at least 7.5 million customers of hundreds of financial institutions had been breached, and most of them from the insurance sector. More broadly, thousands of companies have suffered data breaches impacting tens of millions of customers. A tiny flaw in an obscure cloud-based file transfer software triggered a global privacy disaster. Third-party risk and concentration risk are at the heart of this event. For the most part, the impacted insurers can trace the data breach back to a single third-party vendor, Pension Benefit Information, or PBI. PBI conducted research on surviving family members of pension fund holders. For some insurers, this wasn't a third party, but a fourth or fifth party vendor. PBI often supplemented insurance risk assessment services conducted by the insurer's third party. Yet it seems astounding that so many institutions across so many different business lines all over the world happen to transmit huge amounts of sensitive data to the same single company using the MOVEit software. Given the recent nature of the event, the potential internal failings either at MOVEit, PBI, or any other impacted institutions have yet to come to light. However, we can point to examples of similar events. In fact, in last year's webinar, we spotlighted the zero-day vulnerabilities exploited at Excellion, another third-party file transfer software. It highlights that this is a recurring resilience issue within the financial services industry that is materializing into increasingly severe risk events. In the legal sphere, we can see how events such as these impact the reputation of an institution. Ever since the MOVEit data breaches have become public knowledge, more and more impacted customers have brought class action lawsuits against their banks and insurers. Allegations commonly include mismanagement of sensitive data, inadequate protection of network servers, and breaches of fiduciary duty. Similar lawsuits filed over the Excellion breaches typically settled for millions of dollars. The ORX News podcast for this month will delve more into the MOVEit hacks, and a member of the news team is currently working on a deep dive into the event, which will also be released in October. As always, we will continue to update the news digest as more information becomes available. To round out the resilience section, I'd like to briefly spotlight a recent success story that exemplifies the core DORA pillars of incident reporting and information sharing. In August 2023, 7 Italian banks suffered DDoS, or distributed denial of service attacks. The perpetrators were pro-Russian hacktivists that began targeting Italian institutions after the Prime Minister expressed support for the Ukrainian president in the Russia-Ukraine war. Following hacks on transport companies, the Italian National Cybersecurity Agency quickly notified other institutions of the threat. The message was passed along by an initiative to strengthen cyber resilience in the country's financial system. The banks were warned that they were likely to be the next targets. Soon enough, the next day, the banks were hit by the DDoS attacks. The authorities' forewarning allowed the banks to respond really quickly. They followed regulatory guidance very closely, and all services were resumed and performing normally in a matter of hours. Events such as these are small but powerful examples of how prioritizing embedding operational resilience can mitigate something potentially disastrous for an unprepared firm. On that note, I'll pass back to Lily to close out the webinar. Thank you for listening.
Apologies, I stopped sharing instead of unmuting myself. Thank you everyone for joining us, and I hope you found all the themes and topics interesting. We do still have 5 minutes, so if anyone has got any questions, we may be able to cover them now. If we're not able to cover them live, we will pick these up at a later stage and get back to you via email. You will receive a feedback form via email with the recording. If you want to catch up with it or if you want to share it with any of your colleagues, we'll just ask for your opinion about today's webinar and also for topic suggestions for future webinars as well. As I said, all of the response previously have really informed today's themes, so it's really useful to hear from you. I can see there are some questions in the chat. It's quite a specific question. Okay. Earthquake related. In ORX news, we have some extreme weather related events that have been covered under physical risk. So I suggest the best thing to do is to use that scenario category to have a look at the news stories categorized under physical risk, and they may provide some examples. I don't believe we've covered any earthquake specific. We've covered hurricane and extreme cold weather in Texas where branches were shut and other similar events, but we haven't covered earthquake specific ones yet.
And I would just add to that I would imagine that your firm would have a robust business continuity plan, which would include the trigger event itself, and then also the reporting and that business continuity exercise of how you would inform people, the key actions that you would take. So it might be worthwhile just touching base with your business continuity rep, just for that specific example.
Thank you. And see another query. Yes, you will receive the slides. You should have received the slides in the reminder email, but you will receive the slides as well as the recording, and we will publish these on the members site as well as the news site. So all of this will be available for anyone to look back on. Thank you.
And Vinay, I'm not ignoring your question, but I'll come back to you on the chat on that one.
Great, thank you. Are there any final questions about any other themes that we've discussed today? If not, you can find all of the resources that we've used for today's webinar on the ORX news site and the member site, and we really look forward to hearing from you in the feedback form. And if you do have any suggestions about specifically what risk type you're interested in, we will happily focus on those next time and take a closer look. I'll give one more minute to see if any questions appear in the chat, and then I'll let you all go. Okay, I'll take it as there's no more questions. So thank you everyone for joining today. Thanks to the presenters. I'll look forward to the next one. Thank you very much.